What is something that helped you? You can either just share or put it on the chat.
Can I share, Joe?
Please go ahead.
I just wanted to share that last year, October, I was diagnosed with a sciatica that I had to go for an operation. And God is so great. I said I will wait until December to see when I go back to the farm and see if I can heal. And through God's grace, I have healed. I am much stronger than ever, but I have learned a lot during these few months that we should never take healing and the ability even to breathe and to be thankful for granted. So I just wanted to share, God is really great. We sometimes rush to do certain things without thinking, and I'm very glad that I was shown not to rush and that nature can also heal us. Thanks.
Thanks, Leo. What inspirational words. And I remember that experience when you first shared that and how you didn't rush to go to the um, operation route. So that's lovely. So the Heart Guide has said on the chat, being silent helped. She found silence nourishing. Mike says, hearing the other person acknowledge my experience and emotion and apologize. Very powerful. Marisha, telling the truth helped being honest and transparent, even though it was uncomfortable. Yes. Sometimes we skirt around the truth. For me, it was I had an experience where my boss and I were at loggerheads, and I had always been his favorite, and we had a falling out, and over a year our entire relationship turned toxic, and what once used to be the most beautiful, amazing relationship was now in ruin. And we had a formal mediation, and what helped me was simply being heard, because I had felt during this whole falling apart of our relationship that he wasn't listening to me, and I wasn't being heard. So for me, it was being heard. Great. Thank you, everyone. And we have a few more guests who've joined us. Welcome. We are discussing restorative justice. So today we have three speakers who are going to share with us. Firstly, we have Mike Batley from the Restorative Justice Center. Then we have Nobuntu Penka Matuleni, who is a pastor and a lecturer at Stellenbosch University. And we have Marisha Singh Naika, who is a counselor and pastoral healer. How we are going to progress today is we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to ask the three of them a series of questions. And then, especially as there's so few of us here today, let's engage once we've had the initial round of questions, and put your comments and questions and reflections on the chat. Or when we're done with the formality, then we will open it up so you can unmute and share. So to begin, Mike, please share with us for 10 to 15 minutes about what restorative justice is in relation to the formal legal system and the roles of both the victim and the perpetrator in the whole process. Over to you, Mike.
Right. Thank you so much, Jill, and afternoon, everybody, from my side. I don't know if you want to go back to slideshow view, Jill, or just leave it like that so you can see the any other activity, but it's not on slideshow at the moment.
And now?
No.
Okay, that's weird because it's on
There we go.
slideshow.
Sometimes it takes a moment to go through. Yeah, it's
Okay,
showing now. Cool. Yeah.
all right.
Okay, so let me just preface what I'm going to say with just this realization as we were preparing. I think that all journeys are obviously unique. So mine and my understanding of restorative justice is unique to me and the particular context in which that has played out. And that differs from that of Nabuntu and Marisha. And we agreed in the preparation that some context and some sharing of some understanding was important to put up at the start so that we're starting to build a bit of a shared frame of reference and also become aware of the different understandings, but also different ways in which restorative justice is understood and then played out. So I'm going to try and do that in terms of my own journey and my understanding as succinctly as possible. So I've just noted the main points there. So my own background is as a social worker. And while I was working as the supervisor of a unit in social development in Pretoria, that was writing pre-sentence reports. So that's essentially social workers in that context, usually called probation officers, who are advising the courts about an appropriate sentence with comprehensive psychosocial reports. And I got exposed to restorative justice in that context. So that was 95, 96 in the what was happening around us then of child justice and children being released from police custody. And so coming out of that, a colleague and I started the Restorative Justice Centre in 1998, and I left DSD at the end of 2000. So our service offering then has evolved in this way then mainly court-based mediation and with criminal matters, not with other matters, but also dialogue in correctional settings prior to people being released on parole. And more recently, we've been working on how do we expand that into the workplace, into schools and other community settings. We can work with pretty much any situation, any crime, but we have had a specific focus on these areas of intimate partner violence, hate incidents, and environmental crime. Next slide, please. So I've put the book cover of this book, Changing Lenses, by Howard Zehr. That's actually the second edition. The first edition was the one that I encountered then in 1995. I think it was published 1992. It's still acknowledged as a seminal text in the field. And important to note here is that Howard is a Mennonite, and I don't think that we're very familiar with him in South Africa, which is partly why I'm mentioning it now as well, and that they have a peace theology. They are pacifists, and he has framed, or he framed in that book already, restorative justice within the Hebrew understanding of shalom and the Christian heritage of peacemaking, and provided, I think, a very powerful platform for linking the issues of crime and the criminal justice system with the great themes of scripture, of justice, first of all, but also of truth-telling, acceptance of responsibility, repentance, forgiveness, I think would be the main themes. So some light bulb moments that I still remember very clearly from that time so that's, more than 30 years ago, reading that book and engaging with him at the time. The statement where he says that the conventional Western punitive justice understanding essentially says to an offender, you've harmed someone, so we're going to even things up by harming you. But all that does is increase the amount of harm in the world. And that's, yeah, that's a real light bulb moment. The big question is, how in the world does that translate to justice? But that's pretty much, it's a bit reductive, but that's pretty much what the punitive mindset that we see in our courts is. That's the bottom line. The other statement, which was also a light bulb moment, was this one, that forgiveness is a gift. It should not be made into a burden. And I'm sure we'll pick up on that theme in the course of the conversation. So the conclusion that I reached and has been nurtured over these past 30 years is that justice, biblically understood, is less about punishment and more about making things right, about healing, repair, and change at multiple levels. Next slide, please. I think this is also a very useful snapshot. So it's from a different source, but also that's come to be regarded as a seminal text in the field by Dan Van Ness and Karen Strong in a book called Restoring Justice. And they list these as the elements, as the values of restorative justice: encounter, amends, reintegration, and inclusion. And then these other points as the elements of the values. So just touching or highlighting a couple of those. Encounter involves a meeting and the telling of stories, which, because it's not a formal process, it's not a legal technical process, is typically or contains quite a lot of emotion, and which frequently then leads to understanding and an agreement. Not necessarily, and it's not guaranteed, and it's not necessarily a failure if it doesn't lead to that. But in the sort of broader understanding, that's what would happen. And within that, then, if it works well, the value of amends would be upheld through the perpetrator accepting responsibility and apologizing. And of course, we all know that it's easy to apologize after you've been caught, after the fact. But this text is clear to emphasize that if that is authentic, it will be demonstrated by changed behavior and making restitution and going beyond the direct amount of harm that the victim has suffered. So making right beyond so to put a word on that, if the harm has been suffered is a monetary value of 100 Rand, then the perpetrator would seek to go beyond that and not limit it to 100 Rand. You can see the other elements there. I think that that point about acknowledging human dignity and worth is absolutely key. And I think in South Africa's understanding, as other people have involved, as the movement, which is still a fledgling movement, but as that is evolving and how it's been connected to our constitutional values, human dignity is absolutely central to that. And so perhaps a nuance of restorative justice is that it is about affirming and helping people to reclaim their fundamental human dignity. And that applies to everybody, obviously to victims, direct victims, secondary victims as well, but also to perpetrators. Next slide, please. I think this is quite an important part of understanding as well. First of all, the point at the top there, when can a restorative process be done? So a restorative process is the term used in the United Nations Handbook. And I think that's significant because it broadens our understanding beyond just mediation, which can be limiting. So it allows for dialogue and various forms that can take. But when can it be done in a particular incident? It can be done informally without engaging the formal criminal justice system at all. But then at these other important points, at a pre-trial level, in which case the perpetrator wouldn't be convicted, wouldn't have a criminal record. Or it can be done at a pre-sentence level, in which case the person would have a conviction and have a criminal record. And it would inform the sentence. or it can be done at a post-sentence level, typically as part or prior to the release on and parole, and as part of the reintegration of that person into society. So often the question is, with what sort of cases, and surely you can't do it in all cases. And the simple answer to that is you can do it in all cases, but it's the point in the system is then crucial. So you wouldn't deal with a very severe case informally or at a pre-trial level that might be pre-sentence or post-sentence. Next slide, please. Generally speaking, these are the typical outcomes of a restorative justice process. So an apology, restitution, and performing some service for the victim or some community service as a way of making right to the community. And you'll see that those first 4 points are dealing with the needs of the victim, with acknowledging the harm and some sort of redress. Referring the offender to some sort of assistance to address their needs, and then developing a plan, a set of steps that can be taken to reduce the possibility of this thing happening again. That would be looking at the offender's needs and the general needs of the community. And so you can see how those outcomes balance and try to address the needs of all the stakeholders. Next slide, please. In our current context in South Africa of intimate partner violence and restorative justice, obviously we have the high prevalence, the outrage, the call for harsher punishment, very low levels of reporting and very low conviction rates. And so I would suggest that it's logical, quite rational, for us to explore other options. I'm not saying that we should ignore or say we should leave behind the criminal justice system or not try and strengthen that or improve it. But I do think that it's just rational to say that we shouldn't put all our eggs in that basket, because I think that's expecting way too much from a system that is clearly coming apart at the seams, not only in South Africa, but across the world. The scenarios that we've been working with in the RJC would be the following. Couples struggling with violence who request assistance. So that would be at the informal level without engaging the system. Couples where one party has applied for a protection order. So no criminal matter, but at that point where the protection order is applied for, people could be requesting assistance, but we've had very, very few of those. Situations where a protection order has been violated, so then it goes to the criminal court. And then criminal complaints of assault or serious assault in an intimate relationship. So there may or may not be a protection order involved there. And that's actually been where most of our cases have come from. But I think it's true to say that both parties, especially the victim, but not only the victim, feel disempowered and without agency at this point of the situation and of their lives. So our approach to applying restorative justice to intimate partner violence, let's just get back to that slide. Yeah. So we've been doing this since 2001 and with a dedicated focus on GBV since 2020. When I say since 2001, that was when we started functioning and promoting this as an option to the courts around Pretoria. And almost immediately, gender-based violence matters were part of the caseload. So without looking for it, that's what we got. These are some of the criteria that we've used for considering cases. So an informal assessment by the prosecutor and the probation officer, which would then be supplemented by the restorative justice mediator to whom the case is referred to. And these have evolved a little bit over time. So the first would be this distinction between intimate terrorism or common couple violence. That's a term that's used in some of the literature. And I think that's an important distinction. Whether both parties agree to the referral, and so this point that no one should ever be coerced into participating in mediation, ensuring that the victim is safe, and looking at the parties' mental, emotional, and physical health, and whether there are things like suicide ideation or attempts. Dynamics like insecurity, self-blame, cultural differences, and conflict arising from those, and how a mediation then would intersect with other processes that are pending, like court trials. So obviously, if we're getting the referral from the criminal court, from the prosecutor, then that process is essentially being put on hold. But we're very much aware that our process is then playing out in the shadow of the law. But almost all the clients that we've received in that way do choose to proceed with mediation. So we start with individual interviews with the perpetrator and the victim, explain it to them. And if they agree, then we proceed to the mediation, the meeting. Typically, an agreement is reached, and we would then refer to other services as well, like nonviolent communication training, sometimes counseling, or abuse with substance abuse. This would be contained in a fairly comprehensive report that would be co-signed by a supervisor, so there's some quality assurance there, and then sent to the probation officer, who then submits it to the prosecutor. And we do that within a 6 to 8 week turnaround, because that's the timeline that we've managed to find as comfortable, but also that the court is comfortable with, because they are under pressure not to let matters drag out and to have full court rolls and cases continually being postponed. We've tried over the last few years to do some evaluations by third parties. And so 2 criminologists, there's a third a little bit earlier that I'm just going to refer to these 2 in February 24, and which has just recently been updated. 2 criminologists from the Free State University Department of Criminology. And the feedback that have then gathered from engaging with the people who've participated in these processes are generally high levels of satisfaction, which include saying that it was a good experience, they experienced it as fair, the apology was experienced as genuine, there was an agreement reached, and it had a positive emotional impact and was empowering for victims, and also that there were positive signs of behavior change on the part of offenders. And I'm just going to show you a couple of graphs with some of the specific questions that were asked. So this was, what were your feelings after participation in the mediation? And that was directed to victims. And you can see the questions then: feeling empowered by the process, think the process brought justice to the offense, better understood the offender's situation, think the mediation benefited the offender, and feel that the event has been adequately resolved. You can see the majority were all a yes. Next slide, please. And so putting the same question to the offenders, no surprise, but again, the majority and more of them answered in the affirmative as well. Next slide. I think I'm going to pause on this one. So I'm not going to go through this one right now, because I think these points will probably come up in our conversation, and perhaps we can just consolidate some of those with some of the concerns that are typically raised about the application of restorative justice in the situation of intimate partner violence. So I'm going to pause it there. Thanks very much, Jill.
Thank you, Mike. I really loved your light bulb moment where you said forgiveness is a gift and it shouldn't be made into a burden. I think that was really powerful and set the scene for the rest of your explanation, which really served to make restorative justice something that we could understand more easily and grasp more. And I'd like to now bring in Ubuntu and Marisha. So, firstly, Marisha, could you share with us your perspective on restorative justice based on your experience as a pastoral counselor and how you've used restorative justice in the community context or seen it used? Thanks, Marisha.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you, Mike, for just that great overview of your work and restorative justice in a formal setting. So I would say my experience in work would be more informal, and initially came from my internship working with Kente Circle in the US, where we had to visit in communities, but then also at the different centers, whether it was in a prison or whether it was in a group home, dealing with the issue of restorative justice and using the tool of circle keeping. And then within South Africa, in the church context, it became used in the pastoral counseling ministry that I was involved in, often in family settings, and then with my work with Heartlines, who has a ministry working in prison, in the prison settings. And then the little work that I did in the prison settings was with Hope Prison Ministry, which is one of, I think, a national organization as well, working with the restorative justice framework. So when I look at it, I think, and from what I've experienced, it has been quite helpful in situations or spaces, for example, like families or communities, where the goal is really to repair relationships and trust that has been broken. And often at times, families will not always be able to say that, I want a divorce, or I don't want to be in relationship with you any longer. But they want to find a way of how can we still at times coexist for that moment, but then how do we repair not just the harm, but how do we repair the relationship? So the relationships become most important than the rules of what has been happening or broken, and how do we repair the harm that was done, but also repair this relationship. And so it has been a process that does take a long while. It's not one where some of the I think terms or phrases, let's just forgive and forget, or let's just say sorry and go back to how it was. So this process of restorative justice in a family would mean that the family or the people involved will commit to this long, and sometimes it's a painstaking process of how do we repair the harm that was done, how do we start to heal. And this healing means that, it takes intentionality, it takes accountability, and it prioritizes safety. So I think also assessing, is this process of restorative justice really necessary, or can it work in this situation? And in certain situations, whether it's in the family context or the church context or the community context, it may not be possible because, the harm is still there, or the person that is the offender or the perpetrator may not even being able to say, this is what I've done wrong and this is how I want to make right. Or they may start to, minimize how they've impacted, or even recognize the impact of what they've done. So there are different things that needs to be done in that setting to find out, firstly, will this work? Is it going to be helpful and beneficial for the people that were hurt? for the survivor, for the victim? And is the person that is offended, are they willing to listen in that space? I think that's what's also quite important, that it prioritizes the conversations that need to happen. And so the safety, the courage that's needed, and then the accountability. And a lot of that comes from the circle keeping process and co-creating these conversations of safety, of courage, and accountability. So I've seen it in that particular settings in religious context or church context, and then also community context as well.
Thank you, Marisha. That was really insightful. And key for me is what you said right towards the end when you said it's the conversations that are complex and take time. And I think you illustrated the time needed very well. Thank you. Let's go to Nubuntu. From a theological and cultural perspective, what is it important to consider when we approach restorative justice?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Marisha. And thank you for having me in this conversation. It's my first time, and I wish I could just sit and listen. Coming from the church as a pastor and as a theologian, restorative justice requires us to resist the idea of artificial peace or quick reconciliation. And I like to go, especially when we talk church, I like to go to the verse that we as preachers and pastors, we don't normally go to, let alone preaching about it, because we're trying to keep God going. It's Luke 12. I'm not preaching, don't worry. At 49, this is where Jesus speaks about bringing fire and division. That is not the language we do speak at the church, right? But what Jesus means about that, it's a truth revealing disruption. When the truth enters the room, it challenges the idea that peace is always immediate or comfortable. Sometimes truth must first unsettle the foundation, rattle false harmony before real healing become possible. For instance, let me talk about very briefly about divorce. There is that verse that people will run to. God hates divorce. Does God like the situation where there is no peace? Does God love when people are battering each other as long as they don't deserve divorce? So restorative justice has to begin not with silence or avoidance, but with truth-telling and accountability.
Thank you,
and the
Nubuntu.
courage to name the harm.
Yeah, thank you, Nubuntu. And let's talk about forgiveness. Our religions, no matter what religion we subscribe to, most, if not all religions, tell us to forgive. And How do we deal with accountability of the perpetrator in terms of this focus on forgiveness that we hear is needed from a religious point of view?
Even from cultural point of view, Jill, it's that now let's not talk about it because we already talk about forgiveness. Forgiveness must be understood with care. Our religious tradition, as you put it so well, emphasize forgiveness more than anything. But forgiveness cannot be used to bypass accountability or to pressure victims into premature reconciliation. And I also like the slide, that light bulb of Mike, that forgiveness is a gift, is something that I will give you because I want to, not because it's part of anything. It should not be even in the conversation. It need to come from the victim survivor herself at some point down the line. Because what needs to happen is accountability, not pressure, the premature reconciliation. Forgiveness in restorative sense is not forgetting either or excusing harm. It does not automatically mean we reconcile. Reconciliation requires pure truth, repentance, change of behavior, safety, as Marisha said, and time.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. Truth and accountability before forgiveness. I love that. Let's go to you, Marisha. When is restorative justice most appropriate in your experience, and when is it not appropriate?
So let's start with maybe when it's not appropriate. So if there's ongoing abuse or harm, and there is still a force or coercion or manipulation that is still happening, one can never expect for the victim or the survivor to then sit in the same room with an offender, and that would, because the protection and safety will obviously come first in that situation. So that would be a big red flag that, this is definitely not the time or the space or even where restorative justice can be considered. I think I mentioned it earlier as well, is when the person that has done the harm is still minimizing and saying, it wasn't that bad, or kind of gives many excuses for this is why I did it, this is what, and hasn't come to the realization that I need to take responsibility, because then that is not going to be a restorative process. There has to be a space and place where the person says, I can see what I've done is wrong, and apart from the excuses. So also at times, when I think like Mike was talking about some of the criminal issues that goes on, that they see in the legal and judicial system. And sometimes, when the crime is really severe, restorative justice may not be, appropriate in that specific place or time. So when would it be then? It would be when, for example, in a context or in a relationship where the goal is really to repair the relationship and to keep accountability, while prioritizing the safety and while promoting healing. So it would be often in a space where, families want to still stay together, where they recognize, this harm has been done, but we want to repair the relationship than us parting ways completely. And so it would, in that space, be appropriate. And we both agree. There's no, part of someone is forced to be in it, especially the victim, and especially where they are not given voice. It's one where they will be given voice, where they will be prioritized, what has happened to them, where they can share how they feel, and where the person who is harmed will have to listen to that. In that conversation, will have to listen really well to what has happened. So it's not just about that punishment, and both are willing to engage, like I said. And then the safety, can really be managed, in that there would be a way to how do we now build back trust. And again, it needs to be consistent, it needs to be intentional. The whole pattern of behavior in many ways have to change. And so it would look at really repairing the relationship in the long run, and not just stopping that harmful behavior, but transforming those harmful behaviors into positive ones that's done intentionally and consistently.
Thanks, Marisha. I liked what you said about building back up the trust. I think that's like really key in terms of when it's most appropriate and when it can be used. Let's go to you, Mike. In your many years of experience at the Restorative Justice Centre, what have been some of the challenges you've received about the validity of the restorative justice process, and perhaps some examples or just your general experience, and then also how do you address these?
Perhaps you could just go to the previous slide, Jill. I think those would be the I suppose a summary of the concerns that have surfaced, in doing presentations and speaking with people and so on, and then also from the literature. So there are several handbooks that are available, not so much locally, but internationally. And I remember one of them from Europe spoke specifically about how the trend over the last number of years has been to move away from viewing domestic and intimate partner violence as a private affair to saying it is public. It is something that community and society have a say in as well. And so with the restorative justice process, one is, in a sense, going back to giving that power to the parties themselves. But I don't, and so maybe that's a problem. But I don't think that disqualifies a restorative approach, especially when it is the phrase that I used earlier, in the shadow of the law. These others, the insufficient denouncement of minimizing, as Marisha said, I think that is definitely always a risk. And of course, the power imbalances. If somebody is dominant, and the other party is fearful, doesn't have much confidence, is feeling disempowered, that's a concern. I think also one of the key ones is, if you think of the classic cycle of abuse, of the perpetrator apologizing, promising not to do it again, appearing to make right, buying flowers, but not really accepting responsibility for his own behavior. And then that cycle continues, and so then there would be the build-up of tension, the triggers, and it would start all over. And so if one doesn't have some understanding of that, especially in the assessment, then a restorative process and the facilitator of that process could actually be stepping into an enabling role. So I think that is a valid concern as well. But I think with all of that has indicated to us the need for good assessment. And so taking these concerns seriously, but trying to hear beyond them and hear them deeply from the individuals involved, and making sure that one doesn't apply pressure. Yeah, in terms of, situations that have not worked, or that we've had certain comebacks, or people have come back and said, this was a disaster and we shouldn't have done it, and perhaps trying to actually mount some sort of campaign against the fact that we have been offering the service now for 25 years. We've had none of that. Now, we haven't shouted it from the rooftops, but we haven't been silent about it either. So that's also just interesting. And then getting that feedback through the independent evaluators has also been quite reassuring, that it seems like we're doing something right. I think, let me pause it there.
Thank you very much, Mike. I'd like to go back to you, Marisha. How do we ensure that restorative justice is truly victim or survivor centered? Because we understand that this is what is the hallmark of restorative justice, being victim and survivor centered. But in your experience, how do we actually ensure that this happens?
Yes, it's key to this process. Is consent is very important. I think Mike mentioned this earlier, that there are stark power imbalances that often is present in the relationships, and in centering the survivor's voice, the survivor needs, it means allowing them in some ways to lead what the process is about and how it will be done, but also giving consent, for them understanding, this is what a restorative justice process looks like. And it would also mean that at any time, that they feel that their safety is prioritized in that being key. So at any time that they feel like, I don't feel safe, or this is not going to work, that they feel that they know they have the power to, either halt the process or to exit, and that they never feel trapped by it. And allowing them also to have that safe space to ask questions, to vent, to share their anger. I think sometimes that's often suppressed. We want to move them along like, okay, you must kind of get over it now. Your healing is kind of controlled, or your healing and how you do it is controlled. Like, okay, it's too much crying, or you're using a very angry tone, So those things are big no-nos when it comes to what it means to prioritize the survivor and the survivor needs. And so it would really take also active listening for all the parties involved when a survivor is speaking, to believe what they're saying, to look and listen deeply for what they are trying to communicate and how they are sharing that as well. And I think that's important in the support that's needed, in the safety and protection that's needed, and then allowing the victims, to well, not even allowing, but giving space, or making sure we are listening for their voice to come to the center and not be marginalized, but also for their voice to lead in many ways in the process.
Thank you for that, Marisha. Yeah, safety is fundamental to the process, as you've pointed out. I'd like to ask this final question to all three of you. We'll start with you, Nobuntu. What do faith leaders have to bear in mind when wanting to use a restorative justice process?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think what we need to bear in mind, talking to myself as well, how do we hold accountability and forgiveness together? And I would say to that, accountability remains a non-negotiable. the perpetrator must still face the truth
Mm.
of their action and its consequences. So that it needs to be explicit accountability.
That's powerful. Yes, indeed. Mike, what do faith leaders have to bear in mind when wanting to use a restorative justice approach?
Sure. I'm going to stick my neck out and say that they should think very carefully before engaging the criminal justice system. And that should not be the preferred route. I would say that the preferred route should be a careful utilization of a restorative process with all the concerns and the safeguards that we've been speaking about now. And the reason I'm saying that is preferable is that I think the criminal justice system and the whole approach that it follows is very blunt, and it's not geared towards healing. It's geared just to punish. So that would be my main flag to wave, is to say, without minimizing the seriousness of it in any way, see if there isn't a way to follow a restorative approach. And if all else fails, then go to the criminal justice system. And I'm mindful of the public pressures in the community and maybe beyond. But I think that certainly from a faith perspective, that would be the preferable route to follow.
Interesting insight. Thank you, Mike. And Marisha, let's end with your view.
Thanks, Jill. So just last week, we were speaking to a group of faith leaders, and the words of power, of privilege, and positionality came up with faith communities and faith leaders, and recognizing those things. And I think that's going to be very important for faith leaders to recognize before they even start that process of introducing restorative justice to their community. And because that will help them understand the theologies that they use, whether it comes to forgiveness, whether it comes to repentance or healing or discipline, because often those terms, those theological terms, can be used and misused in harmful ways. And so if you really understand deeply, how does power come into play? How does your position come into play? How does your privilege come into play into understanding those theological terms? And it just not just out there, but it's the lived, how it impacts on the lived reality of people in faith communities is important. So to firstly do that as part of the process of really having a consciousness of what it means when we want to use restorative justice, and making sure that in no ways leans to any side of spiritual abuse, because sometimes, the whole aspect, like we shared earlier, you have to forgive, becomes a spiritually abusive way. So we have to be very mindful of that. And then also to understand that I think the hope that we have in our faith spaces, that people can change, that I think I've sat with families who said, my situation is never going to change. I don't see that there can be any way of healing that will come. And healing doesn't mean that we all are reconciled and we all are happy now. It could mean that the relationship does end, but that reconciliation looks quite differently, and to have hope in that. And what does that mean? It would mean that that relationships become priority more than the rules and regulations of the church, more than the protection of the church and the institutional of the church, and protecting the survivors and the victims. So looking at that as a priority as well. And it requires us not wanting to control healing and saying that, healing should go in this way. Oh, it's too long now, or you're doing it wrong. So really looking at that and what healing means, the truth telling that's needed, which means that we need to have a safe and courageous space with accountability, as Nobuntu mentioned. I think actions to really repair and restore the relationships are important. And it takes time. I think a punishment, you could easily just say, okay, here's the punishment, 1, 2, 3, and it's done. But repairing the relationship takes time, and it needs to be intentional, and it needs to be consistent, and it's really long-term transformation and behavioral change.
Thank you for that. Some key nuggets in there. I love the power, privilege, and positionality. And thanks for reminding us, Marisha, again, that it takes time. This is not a process that can be rushed, and it must be done at the pace and speed of the victim or survivor. So thank you for that. We're now going to move into a discussion with with those of you online. Let us have a look. Is there anything in the chat? Vusi says restorative justice must be used for healing and behavior change instead of being manipulative, which can cause more damage in our communities. Very much so indeed. And I'd just like to say that we, as your hosts, are the Faith Action Collective to End Gender-Based Violence, and we will speak out South Africa. And the way the Faith Action Collective works is that we have working groups that are themed. So they work in specific thematic areas. So Mike has been heading up the working group on restorative justice. And we have a concept document which we have written and which Mike and his team would like to enrich. So it would be great if you gave us some of your feedback on what has been shared today, any questions, any comments, or any specific comments you have to people. And then we can also discuss training. Would you be interested in restorative justice training? So I open that up, and I do encourage you to share either on the chat or just unmute yourself and speak.
Maybe just stop sharing your screen, Nigel.
Perfect. Any feedback from people? Any questions to the speakers?
If I can ask Jill, Chair, through
Go
you,
ahead.
I wanted to know how is restorative justice also looking at mostly the healing part, especially for people that are coming from jail, because many of them are struggling to cope in communities. They either continue what they've been doing before, or they just struggle. So is there any process to restore their healing also as a perpetrator? Thanks.
I think Mark and Marisha, and if you have anything to add, also weigh in on this, Nobuntu.
Yeah, let me just say a couple of things there. I think that the restorative mindset, if you think of those values that I listed, does speak to your question. So a meeting, a restorative process, I think is part of reintegration. And it's really powerful and it's crucial work to initiate the processes of healing, for truth-telling, for people to ask questions, all of that. But I think that your question actually takes us beyond those the focus on those things that I've just mentioned now, and into a related field of, let's call it offender care, reintegration of offenders, which is something quite, it's something on its own, and it's distinct from working with young offenders at a pre-trial, a diversion sort of level. And there are very severe and quite unique challenges in terms of that healing, the rebuilding of relationships, and helping people reestablish their lives in terms of accommodation and employment and so on. So there are a number of people working in that space. It's a very difficult one, as you can imagine, but there are people who, that's their calling. And so there are success stories. But I think that takes us into a slightly related but different space to what we're focusing on today.
Thank you, Mike. There's something else in the chat. Alzethia said she'd like to get, oh, sorry, did Marisha and Nabuntu, do you want to add anything to that?
Just to say, yes, Mike, as Mike said, it is a different process, though there is within the restorative justice process that I know that, for example, Hope Prison Ministry does. So they do the work with the rehabilitation of the prisoners while they are still in prison, and then also with repairing the relationships, and then the third one is reintegration. So, and in that part of repairing the relationships as part of the restorative justice process is where they would work with both the perpetrators and then the victims and the families as well, and have the separate process. But then when they come to a certain point is when they would meet and then talk through that. Heartlines also does this through the active positive presence of men, working with men and then taking them through a journey of understanding their own past and how has that, in terms of taking responsibility and accountability, has impacted, and how do they not then become, repeat offenders, especially when they want to reintegrate it, and how they use it together with the families or the partners of the offenders is through a storytelling approach. When both, the victims, offenders, and the families, they come together, and then they have a specific process for that.
Storytelling is very powerful. Thanks for that, Marisha. Nabuntu, do you want to add anything?
No, Jill, thank you.
Okay. Going to the chat, Tinjiwe says, thank you for a meaningful conversation. Aligning restorative justice to the victim's process of healing was an eye-opener. Thank you, Tinjiwe. And Alzethia says, we would like to get some training around restorative justice for more understanding and knowledge to apply it, as we are field workers of gender-based violence. Mike, perhaps you could share with us the type of training you were thinking of through the Faith Action.
Yeah, we had some brainstorming as a precursor to a call for proposals that was put out a little while ago, but then realized it wouldn't fit that particular call. So at this stage, we don't have anything specific planned, but I can say that at the RJC, we've been doing training, for most of those 25 years. There's quite a lot happening in the broader mediation space. So we're trying to align with that and with accreditation and so on. And so the direction that is going is that one needs to do sort of generic mediator training first, and then specialize into a specific area like family mediation or commercial mediation. And so we are looking at positioning restorative justice mediation in that way. We ran a training as a hybrid a few weeks ago, with some online and some face-to-face, and that includes some practical work. but everybody had either done another mediation training or had some other background, as a precursor to that. So to say to sorry, I forget the name of the person who raised that
Alzethia.
question. Alzethia, yeah. Please reach out to us. We would love to talk and see how we could make that happen. We try and use grant funding to support those kinds of trainings, and it might be easier to do it, organization for organization, and then maybe draw in other people around that organization. That might be a better way of doing it rather than sort of through our network here. Because that would just be, I think perhaps it would need to be broader and at a different level. So let's talk and let's see if it might be possible to make something happen. But we do have a curriculum that is geared for restorative justice theory and practice generally, and then we could draw in some people from this conversation, for example, as well, into the specific application in intimate partner violence and GBV generally.
Great. Thank you, Mike. And Howard says restorative justice must move beyond the goal of restoring and healing only those who have been harmed. In my view, we should also look towards the perpetrators and seek their deep healing so they can fully recognize and take responsibility for the harm they have caused. So we are at the end of our time together. We're just a few minutes over. I'd like to ask our speakers, Marisha, Nobuntu, and Mike, to perhaps touch on that and then give us your closing thoughts towards the perpetrator's deep healing. If you could just make a quick comment on that, if you would like to, and then give us your closing thoughts.
I don't really have much to add. Obviously, agree with Howard, and Howard has been one of our volunteer facilitators, specifically in that space, working with people coming out of prison. But I think that it highlights the need to affirm the dignity of people, of perpetrators as well, even people who have caused serious harm and perhaps been in prison for a number of years. So that's very challenging, but no less relevant and important. And that's one of the reasons why I think restorative justice aligns so powerfully with the value of dignity and with the basic message of the Christian faith.
Thank you, Mike. Nobuntu?
Yes. Yeah, thank you. I just want to actually add to that and actually taking culturally, because very specifically in African cultures, we exist within the relationships. So when I'm hurt, it's not just me. The whole community is hurt. And therefore, it's pathologizing to be actually looking at one particular person. So I agree, it needs to go broader than the victim and the perpetrator, even broader than that, because that messing up the whole fiber of the communities.
Community restoration is really important. Thank you for that, Nobuntu. And Marisha?
Thank you to both. I definitely agree with Howard and what Mike and Nobuntu has said, the aspect of recognizing the dignity of all who are present and all who are affected. And then understanding, like Nobuntu said, the systemic, I think in family systems, as a family therapist, looking at the whole system, the whole interconnectedness of how when one is dehumanized or one dehumanizes, they themselves are dehumanized, and that healing is really, in many ways, we need mutuality in healing. And mutuality in our relationships, which Nobuntu said, that is so important for us. I think it's hard when we come into spaces, but but also to look at it through the lens of power and who is empowered and disempowered in different ways. And that intersectionality is quite important. And sometimes it means that you need to prioritize a survivor's voice. And then at other times, okay, we need to move to looking at, and it's not either or. I think we need to stay away from those dichotomies of either this or either that. But how do we look at wholeness, and how do we look at the intersectionality of healing and the mutuality of it as well?
Thank you, Marisha. We will definitely be sending out the recording of this to those of you who have registered. So I do hope you have all registered. And then we will close our session with the interfaith prayer, which is what we always close with. Our monthly forums, our lunchtime conversations, and our webinars. So I'm just going to share my screen again and share the pledge. And how this works is that somebody reads out the first line in blue, then black, then someone else reads green, and someone else reads black, and then we all speak together the last sentence. So can we have someone who will, you can just unmute yourself, who will read the first in blue?
I will read the first one, Jill.
Thank you. In fact, maybe the blue and the black, because we're a small group. Then who can read from the green and the black? We just need one more volunteer to read that. Okay, Vusi, thank you very much. And then we all read the red. Go ahead, Leo.
Gender-based violence is unacceptable, inexcusable, and intolerable in all its manifestation. Yet we confess that we have sometimes chosen not to see or tolerated gender-based violence. We have been collaborators and co-conspirators against the very essential of our creation.
Vusi? Okay, I'll read it. From our platform within local communities, people of faith potentially play a vital role in raising awareness, advocating for survivors' rights and against impunity, holding perpetrators accountable, and challenging harmful gender norms and gender injustices without fear or favor. Yet we confess that we have often been complicit by our silence, our inaction, our misuse of sacred texts, and our rigid structures that silence or exclude diversity. Thus, we have undermined God's image in all people. Therefore, we commit to standing up, speaking out, and taking decisive action, and to being accountable to survivors, to each other, and to God. Thank you, everyone. I do hope you have a blessed rest of the day.
Thank you, Jill.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you so much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.